Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. President Yoon Suk Yeol has ended his week-long visit to Europe. The highlight was his unexpected visit to Ukraine, where he promised more non-lethal military supplies and over $200 million of humanitarian assistance and financial aid. Another scene to look at in the diplomatic arena last week was the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. There, Foreign Minister Park Jin met Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi and rallied support against North Korea that fired a long-range ballistic missile just before the meetings took place. Now for this, we invite Dr. Ban KIl-joo, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of International and Area Studies, Sogang University. Dr. Ban, welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Mason Ritchie from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Ritchie, thank you for your time.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Now, Professor Ritchie, first question to you. So President Yoon made a surprise visit to Ukraine on Saturday, and he visited the site of mass killings in Bucha and Irpin, where a civilian residential area had been subject to large-scale missile attacks. What does this show?
Yeah, so I think in the first place, this really reflects the Yoon administration's rhetorical focus on universal values. He's talked quite a bit about freedom and prosperity as one of the pillars, not only of his domestic policy, but also foreign policy. And of course, ultimately, the foundation for people living in freedom and people having the chance to build lives of prosperity is that we respect, both domestically and internationally, human rights. So I think that that's clearly part of it, and this reflects the larger emphasis that the Yoon administration has on becoming what it refers to as a global pivotal state, which is to say a state that isn't simply concerned about its role in the Korean Peninsula or in the Northeast Asia region or even in East Asia more generally, but in fact global, and so reflecting global universal values. One has to think that domestic politics also plays a role. I mean, it certainly isn't going to hurt the Yoon administration domestically to be shown as being, quote unquote, on the right side of history and supporting, human rights in a country under attack like Ukraine. And then lastly, Yoon wants to be seen as an important leader, like those in the United States or France or other countries, Japan, France, or Germany, whose leaders have gone to Ukraine as well. And so I think in some sense, this is a sort of pilgrimage for leaders who want to be seen as globally important today.
Right, I see. So this visit was apparently a step to become a global pivotal state. Now, Dr. Ban, President Yoon's such surprise visit to Ukraine was actually made upon Ukrainian President Zelensky's invitation. He apparently sent a letter through the country's First Lady, Olena Zelenska. Now, what role is Ukraine expecting South Korea to play?
Well, first of all, South Korea has focused heavily on humanitarian and non-lethal weapons-based support so far, and it seems to continue a basic policy of not providing military weapons. Meanwhile, I think Ukraine expected South Korea to make more comprehensive support, and South Korea responded to it and promised to play an enhanced role in making peace more visible and widespread. It seems clear that South Korea evolved its policy to a more comprehensive one while diversifying the scope of support for Ukraine. In particular, this summit served as an arena to make South Korea develop policy for rebuilding Ukraine in full swing. In addition, South Korea promised to expand the aid of non-lethal weapons. Military assets might be more urgent from a viewpoint of Ukraine in a situation where it is still at war because the rebuilding project that South Korea proposes to Ukraine is not able to begin until the end of the war. In this vein, it is true that Ukraine needs more lethal weapons, but it appears to instead ask for more comprehensive one to Korea. Although the aid of lethal weapons is not on the table, I don't think this option is completely closed, because security aid, one of the three aids, could have the greater potential. Moreover, South Korea earlier mentioned that it will watch how changing the battlefield situations are to figure out whether it is more supportive of Ukraine than now. As of right now, South Korea has decided to keep a rule of not supporting lethal weapons, One thing is clear though. How to support Ukraine is a matter of Korea's sovereignty, which should not be intervened by external actors.
Right, I see. Since our Dr. Ban tapped on this comprehensive package, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper on this. So the two sides agreed on this package covering security, humanitarian, and reconstruction assistance from South Korea to Ukraine with the so-called Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Now, Dr. Ban, what are the details, and especially what does it mean for South Korea to be part of this so-called the Second Marshall Plan?
Yeah, of course. Comprehensive package looks noteworthy, which is laid out, as you mentioned earlier, under the name of the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Why does it look comprehensive? I would say that it is comprehensive indeed because it covers all three key assets, including security aid, humanitarian aid, and support for Ukraine's reconstruction. To be more precise, when it comes to security assistance, two sides agreed to host the Summit for Peace Formula, and South Korea promised to increase its humanitarian support to Ukraine. In addition to $100 million assistance provided last year and the $150 million assistance for this year, South Korea announced to plan new humanitarian assistance while cooperating with World Bank. What matters more is the third area, which is to enhance cooperation between enterprises of the two sides for rebuilding Ukraine. Mm-hmm. In particular, this summit clarified how South Korea helps rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine. We need to take a look at what South Korea's role in rebuilding Ukraine means in general. The Yoon government has stressed contribution diplomacy since it launched last year. This policy is aimed at making South Korea, which has become a free and developed country thanks to international society, pay back, particularly countries in need. So Ukraine serves as the most optical case for contribution diplomacy. The joint statement notifies this point clearly. If then, how can South Korea help rebuild Ukraine? Actually, South Korea has successfully experienced the rebuilding project earlier overseas. The Jaitun division of South Korea helped rebuild the villages at Arbil in Iraq from 2004 to 2008. Back then, this team provided medical assistance to residents, provided vocational training to them, and built a social and economic infrastructure. This project turned out a great success, as residents at Arbil called the Jaitun division a gift from God. Rebuilding Ukraine could seem different from rebuilding Iraq because the former is expected to be led by civilian companies, but experience itself could be useful for making things done. South Korea is well placed to do this role because it is not only experienced this project, but also has a willingness and capability, particularly under this administration. I think a social and cultural network building, as well as a massive project of building infrastructure, is expected to be made in this process for Ukraine.
I see. It is interesting to hear that this Ukraine is optimal case to show the contribution diplomacy of South Korea. Now, Professor Ritchie, though Dr. Ban pointed out that providing lethal aid is not completely a closed option, for now, Seoul has maintained its position of providing only non-lethal aid to Ukraine. What do you believe was the reason behind South Korea's such decision?
Yeah, so there may be domestic legal hurdles in South Korea to providing this type of lethal aid, but ultimately those are not impossible to overcome, which makes me really think that this is a foreign and security policy decision taken by the Yoon administration, reflecting caution with respect to Russia as a potentially dangerous international actor. A cornered animal, if you will. Moscow can't really help, for instance, with North Korea, which is one of South Korea's, if not South Korea's largest security concern. But Moscow can certainly make North Korea worse for South Korea. And so I think that there's always in the back of any administration's mind on the South Korean peninsula, in South Korea, that the external actors such as Russia can enable North Korea to engage in more mischief and become more dangerous vis-a-vis South Korea. So I think that's one concern. I think in the background, we also have China a little bit. As we know, Russia and China are in what they refer to as a no-limits strategic partnership. Now, I think that there are certainly limits there. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. But Moscow and Beijing are relatively closely aligned, and to the extent that South Korea assists in repelling this Russian invasion of Ukraine with lethal aid, the Union administration may fear that this could make relations with China more difficult. Of course, there are also some economic interests as well vis-a-vis Russia. They're relatively minor, but there's something that's worth keeping in mind. And then, of course, finally, I think the Union administration may think that providing lethal aid directly to Ukraine might cause there to be some domestic political costs for the Yoon administration if the South Korean population feels that that might be something that's too risky to engage in.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Ritchie, let's move on to ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that recently took place. Foreign Minister Park Jin held a one-on-one meeting with Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi, and they reportedly agreed to strengthen bilateral communications and exchanges at various levels. What significance does this have in terms of bilateral relations?
Yeah, so South Korea has ever since Yoon came into office, moved more closely into the orbit of the United States. South Korea has, of course, become much closer with Japan than was the case underneath the predecessor Moon administration. And of course, this makes China nervous. And so, as South Korea has moved more into an orbit that is seen by Beijing as being contrary to Chinese interests, this type of meeting at the ASEAN Regional Forum provides us a chance for the South Korean government to put a sort of floor underneath relations with China. And to signal to China that the relationship between Seoul and Beijing is still important, which of course it is. China remains South Korea's #1 trading partner. Their economies are tightly linked. Regional security is an important consideration for South Korea, especially to the extent that China and North Korea are closely aligned with each other, and therefore, China can make things, either much better or much worse with respect to North Korea and how much of a threat it represents for South Korea. And of course, there are geopolitical considerations, whether that be Taiwan or the South China Sea or other areas. So I think that's one set of reasons. The other, I think, really is to some degree the Yoon administration is simply following in the footsteps of other states that are trying to put a floor underneath relations with Beijing. And this is especially important in the case of South Korea, where there's been a number of recent diplomatic spats between Beijing and Seoul.
Right, I see your point. Now, Dr. Ban, after the talk, through local media outlets, it is said that Wang Yi reportedly underlined the fact that China and South Korea are close neighbors and inseparable partners, like our Professor Ritchie said, and said a third party should have no influence over such a relationship. Now, does this suggest China's hopes to improve the relationship between the two countries in the near future?
To start with, I think South Korea as well as China show their willingness to make the relationship improve through 45 minutes talks. Meanwhile, we need to examine what Director Wang Yi meant by the exclusion of the third party, because it shows China's consistent posture despite its enhanced willingness to improve the relations. Director Wang seems to stress that the U.S. serves as an obstacle to improving the relations between Republic of Korea and China. To put it another way, China appears to be concerned about the most cohesive and strong alliance ever between South Korea and the United States. Beijing believes this strong solidarity serves as a source to hinder the South Korea-China relationship from improving. This recognition shows how the new Cold War is playing in international politics, and China wants to seize the initiative of the new Cold War. In more detail, China seems to feel unpleased with current South Korean administration change of policy on diplomacy and security. The Yoon administration is different from the prior administration in terms of strategic philosophy, the scope of diplomacy, and finally, how to gain security. The current government follows strategic clarity against strategic ambiguity carried out by the predecessor. Second, the former government sought balanced diplomacy, whereas the Yoon government seeks global pure state-oriented diplomacy. Finally, how to gain security is different. The former administration emphasized the peace process, whereas the current administration pays attention to peace through strength. This changing posture has led to making South Korea more recognized in the world and increasing diplomatic leverage to China. I believe China wants to offset this situation, but with a softer posture than before. All in all, both South Korea and China are well aware that each needs the other because of their geopolitical connectivity. In particular, South Korea is more than willing to preside at the ROC Japan-China summit this year as a stepping stone to making the relationship between Seoul and Beijing more cooperative.
Right, so two countries both acknowledge the necessity of each other. Interesting. Now, Dr. Ban, why don't we move on to the North Korean issues as well? Now, many were eyeing the possibility of North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hye's participation in the ARF, but she did not come. Could we say that North Korea is not yet ready to come out to the negotiating table? How did you see this?
North Korea seems to think that a policy of strong versus strong is better than raising its voice in a diplomatic arena, in the sense that the Kim regime fired Hwasong-18 ICBM as the ARF was occurring. If the Kim regime had considered that it would be right about time to focus more on diplomacy or come out to the negotiating table, it must have chosen a different time to launch ICBM. So North Korea seems to believe it is time for the military, not diplomacy now. Meanwhile, there are countries that North Korea focuses on for better diplomacy and solidarity, which are obviously China and Russia. Why? They are always on the side of North Korea as permanent members of the UN Security Council. In short, North Korea takes advantage of the new corridor mechanism to step up its nuclear program. So, all in all, North Korea remains provocative militarily and stays away from diplomacy, primarily thanks to its solidarity with China and Russia. It remains to be seen how sustainable this mechanism will be, though.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Richie, I believe this will be our last question, but we cannot leave out the relationship between South Korea and the ASEAN, right? So, Foreign Minister Park Jin said that Seoul is planning to deepen partnership with ASEAN through the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. What is this initiative and what importance does ASEAN have, not just in terms of dealing with North Korea, but also in pushing Indo-Pacific strategy? Could you briefly tell us?
Yeah, so the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative really helps align South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is sort of what ASEAN calls its Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is important because South Korea does want to diversify its relations away from too much of a preponderance on the United States and China. So part of the idea of a global pivotal state that we talked about is that South Korea is supposed to have a more proactive role in places outside of its comfort zone and outside of areas of close geographic proximity. And so that includes Europe, but it also includes obviously the ASEAN area as well. South Korea does have quite a bit of interest in this. In the first place, obviously economically, where South Korea has tremendous investments through companies, but also geopolitically in places such as Vietnam and Philippines and a number of important ASEAN countries. And in the second place, North Korea, historically, has created quite a bit of mischief in the region through transshipments of various sanctioned goods and products, possibly through using this area as a place for some of its cyber activities, which bring hard currency into the country. So North Korea is somewhere in the background of this as well. And so this Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative is going to focus on core areas of trying to build the strategic partnership between Korea and ASEAN, such as the environment, capacity building, digital connectivity, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, cyber cooperation, and those areas.
All right, I see many areas to cooperate. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Dr. Ban, and thank you, Professor Ricci, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.